Alrighty. Well, you may hear a little bit of buzzing because this phone's on the charger. It probably doesn't need to be on the charger. I might turn it off in a few minutes. Want to have a little bit of a talk again to do with Aboriginal stuff. And there's always a narrative out there of the way everything went, and it's this and it's that, and all the narrative points to usually leftist political agendas and stuff like that. And even with a right-wing narrative or a left-wing narrative, you'd be surprised that the truth is actually a third narrative that you never even thought of. A third reason that never even come to mind and didn't fit either left-wing or right-wing narratives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about segregation and the two cultures side by side that have existed in this country for the last few hundred years. And the interaction and stuff like that, and more importantly, probably the lack of interaction in so many ways. Yeah. So what you tend to find these days, with the way it's all going, is there's this overwhelming left-wing political narrative to a lot of these historic circumstances and happenings. And there will be something that has happened, and they are likely to just get that bare fact and then build an entire left-wing narrative around it. Now the funny thing is, they don't teach you a great deal in schools, and not a great deal of people know that much to do with Aboriginals, to really they get away with these false narratives as a result of the lack of actual knowledge on the real circumstances and the real history. It's one of these things, there's just not much spread or said about it, and even then, some of the stuff I was told in high school I've since found to be complete bullshit, or fairly heavily narrative up. Now, one of the interesting ones that I come across in school was that of Tasmanian Aboriginals. And they taught us that Tasmanian Aboriginals were actually genetically quite different from mainland Aboriginals. Not heaps, but they were almost like a different people. And we saw this documentary made in the 80s with some of the 2 or 3 that were still alive. I think we're talking full-bloods, we're talking 100% Tasmanian Aborigines that were still alive. And yet now I can't seem to find a single thing to do with if they are indeed different genetically. And it's almost like as though, well, no, they aren't type of thing. There's nothing really about it that can be found, and it just seems so bizarre that that's the case. Now, I assume that these handful that were left alive, they were 100% not, half or less, and a lot of the ones you have now are half or less. But I do remember being told that they didn't have the ability to make fire, and they didn't really have a very good boat. Well, they had one that was as bundles of sticks held together, and it wouldn't last for any more than about a mile or so before it would sink. So they could never cross over to the Australian mainland, and as a result they believe they're the only people on Earth. And we also had the narrative pushed that when white man come, it was like aliens landing. And yeah. Tasmania is rather interesting in the fact that they actually made an attempt to round up all the Aboriginals on the island, and this whole bullshit leftist narrative you get, that they never fight back and we just come in and we just massacre the shit out of a lot of them, it was extremely false, very false. There is near me, as I've mentioned before a few times, a fortified building, and apparently fortified buildings were not uncommon down in Tasmania, and it was very common for you got to realise that this whole idea, oh well, we just come in, boom, boom, boom. Well, the army might have been able to do something. The free settlers had no bloody hope. They're out there, one person on their own, no one coming to help with a flintlock rifle, versus guys who were absolute experts at camouflage with spears. They reckon it would take you 3 times as long to get the bloody flintlock rifle loaded, or even just primed after you already had it loaded, and fired off, than it would for an Aboriginal to throw a spear, and there's quite a number of them that were killed. Having said that, this becomes such a bit of an issue, they decided that they were going to try and round up all the Aboriginals in Tasmania. And it was one of the most god-awful flops you could imagine because of their ability to hide so well. They went up into the northern area of Tasmania, which now turns out the northwest is some of the most unfertile shit land you could imagine. Full of rocks and cliffs and plenty of forest, but you can't seem to grow anything there very well. And so the only thing they can do there is grow forest and oysters, and, well, that's about it. There is a fair bit of fishing up there in terms of crayfishing and stuff like that as well, but they made this attempt to go from, in the northern half of the island, go from west to east. And in that attempt to round up the whole lot of them, they managed to get one old man who was probably in his 80s, and a young woman who was estimated to be about 21, who had a little baby with her. And that was it. That's all they got. Hundreds of men out there marching through the rifle, and that's all they got. So at a later point, they ended up putting some in an encampment in this. A lot of things down there are stone buildings because a lot of that was built in the 1820s and the 1830s, and yeah, they put them in there, and the common cold got in and wiped the majority of them out, unfortunately. But yeah. So anyway, I want to talk a bit about this whole idea that white men just turned up and massacred the shit out of everything. Now, I'm not saying there weren't the obvious couple of blasts here and there and confrontations, because there were, but as it turns out, when they turned up to Australia in Sydney Cove, when they turned up, this is another leftist lie, Aboriginals never done anything to harm the environment, they never burnt anything out, and they've actually started this idea that it's a myth that they used to burn stuff off. Well, it was bullshit, because when they turned up to Sydney Cove, the skies were very dark, and it wasn't lack of sunlight or overcast conditions, it was the amount of smoke in the air from Aboriginals burning out parts of forest to renew the place. It also was very good hunting time, because all the animals were just trying to escape the fire, and you could just there was no holding back on the amount of kangaroos that could be gotten that were escaping that area. Yeah, so long and short of it is they turned up and they actually saw natives there as they initially, come to land and all that. And, well, no, they didn't massacre the shit out of them, because they were actually under orders not to, because when you look at it, what help was coming? The nearest big army post they had might have been Malaysia, Singapore, maybe. They're definitely in India. But what help was coming? Probably none. You know, and if things went bad, that was it. They were all buggered. In fact, they almost gave up after the first 7 years because of failed crops. They almost threw the towel in, and they almost bloody starved. And they were considering, well, you know, if this isn't a good year, we're going to have to start eating our grain we've used for seed, and then that's it. We're going to fucking starve here. We won't even get back to England. They managed to pull through, but initially when they turned up to Sydney Cove, contrary to this idea that everyone was running scared and women and kids were scared shitless and all that, they actually were completely apathetic. They didn't give a fuck. They saw a few natives and whatnot, and some of them, you know, tried to say something. Neither could understand the other, I believe, and ultimately there's a lot of diary logs that as they were initially trying to do whatever they were doing with their convicts, try and set up an encampment for them and whatnot, you know, there'd be diary logs from the soldiers that I went from this area to that area, and as I walked past there was a woman with a baby collecting shellfish. The woman ignored me, so what? And they'd ignore the woman. And it was just like, sort of like, you know, she was collecting shellfish, she was doing her own thing. So what if there's a man dressed like a fucking clown in his red British Army uniform, his red coat? So what? They just didn't care. They were doing their thing, and they were doing their thing, and ultimately that was that. And so it was all sort of very apathetic. They were side by side, and neither one was annoying the other one, and they just done their own thing. And when you look into segregation in Australia, a lot of it was, in many ways, self-imposed. And, you know, everybody's like, oh, well, they, you know, cut them out. Oh, it's apartheid. It's South African apartheid. No, it's not. They just didn't give a shit. And they didn't want anything to do with what we were doing, because we were doing our thing and they were doing their thing, and that was it. You know? Now, there was disagreements, obviously, in due course when all these bizarre other animals, these fluffy animals turned up known as sheep. And they decided, well, hell, these things don't run fast, they're a bit of an easy pick, and they spared a few. And then there was hell to pay because, you know, they never realised that these animals were owned by anyone. Even the concept of ownership is very hazy and phasey, really speaking. Not only amongst Aboriginals, but even amongst Solomon Islanders. It's sort of like the idea of land ownership and ownership of native stuff. It's more a tribal ownership than a personal ownership. And that's just sort of, you know, that's what it is. And, you know, even today with Solomon Islanders, when it comes to land, you know, they're just, yeah, they got some strange ideas as well that don't really mesh with the common European ideas of land and land ownership. And anyway, there's another story that's come from not too far from where I am about a lake that's well known, and basically this lake is sort of artificial, but it's based on a whole bunch of swampy land that was deliberately probably dredged out with a drag line or something like that. It might, well, I think it's even earlier than that. I think it might have been the old horse and cart, and there's a certain sort of it's like a scraper. My father's used them behind a tractor to build dams, and it's a handheld thing, and they used to pull them with horses, and they used to make basements in the United States with them originally, And we've actually got some. I've shown some that we've got that are old ones. And it's basically like a giant bloody shovel that's towed from the front. And you've got these two handles at the back that are only used to control the depth. And you've got to be very careful it doesn't go in too deep because it'll flip over. And then there's also an option where you flip it over and empty it out. And that's sort of, you know, probably what they turned it into. It is all lined, the sides of it are lined with stone, so it was deliberately turned from a decent area of random swamp into a very shallow but large artificial lake. Anyway, the story goes that there was a local man who, you know, he's probably a reasonably prominent member of the community or whatever, and he was down there, as many people would be down there, with his sheep, giving the sheep a bit of water, and he was wondering what the name of it was. And see, this is another thing, the idea that white culture, 100% flooded black culture, and there's not a single part of it in existence in today's society. That's bullshit. Because there's a large amount of animals and plants named from Aboriginal names. Galah, kangaroo, wallaby, quokka. I wouldn't be surprised even if koala was an Aboriginal, and a whole heap of plants as well, all Aboriginal names. Now on top of that, there's town names. In fact, where I grew up on a farm, and the farm had an Aboriginal name as well as the town had an Aboriginal name. Now they're very long strung out names, not surprisingly. But there used to be a tendency amongst the locals to ask the Aboriginals what the name of this animal was, what the name of this place was, what the name of this lake was, and in that there was sometimes a loss of translation. And this lake was based off a name that this prominent member of community asked a young Aboriginal woman what the name of this lake was. So he walked up to her, "Madam, do you know the name of this lake?" And she was busy, I don't know, doing whatever, probably pissing around with reeds, because they used to make things out of reeds or something. And lo and behold, she didn't even look up at him. But she gave him the answer, or so he thought, and she said, "Wandare." So he went on his way, proud as punch that he had communicated with a local young lady who had told him that the name of the place was Wendouree, and he went around and told everyone that this is Wendouree Lake. And that's the Aboriginal name for this. So that place, it was also known as someone or other's swamp. No, now it's actually known as Wendouree. So this will be Wendouree Lake, and at the moment it's just Wendouree Swamp, because that's the Aboriginal name. So instead of calling it John Swamp or whatever it was just some Englishman's name, then we're going to call it Wendouree. So he decided to tell everybody over the next few months that this place was called Wendouree. So now it's known as Wendouree Lake, and there's a suburb beside it known as Wendouree. Except the only problem is that Wendouree was go away in Aboriginal. So it's basically go away lake. That's why she didn't look at him. Self-imposed segregation. She wanted him to fuck off. So she said, "Go away." And now, for the last couple of 100 years, it's been called Go Away Lake. It's some funny stories like that. There has been, especially out in the further parts, some large reservations set up. And this is where the story of segregation sort of comes in. There were shopkeepers who were a little bit funny about Aboriginals going into some shops, and they couldn't quite understand why. But having said that, they could always get served at the back door, but not through the main front entrance, I believe. Or at least, and the same applied for Chinese too. Chinese would be served through the back door, but you can't go in the main entrance with the shops because, well, the other customers don't like seeing Chinese in there, and I think don't like seeing Aboriginals in there as well, and I think that was the case during the 1800s. You know, imagine upper crust British women seeing an Aboriginal man walking in with a bit of wooden implements, basically completely in the nude. Sometimes they'd cover themselves in ash, and that was their clothing, put a bit of ash on themselves, and yeah, well, I think it might be a bit intimidating, so anyway, it just became the norm that they didn't really like serving them directly in shops. But back to the story of the reservations, because that's interestingly where segregation sort of comes into it. Now, they had many of them on reservations. Unfortunately and stupidly, they had a lot of them moved from their original area. So some would be allowed to stay in the original area and others would be moved to another reservation with no idea of the concept of what land meant to them and tribally owned land meant to them. But anyway, what they'd have to do, you'd have a main office which would be just one white guy who was a government employee, and you'd have to go into that office as an Aboriginal person to get a permit to travel, and they'd allow you to travel, you know, quite a few times a year to go and see relatives on another reservation. But you needed that permit in case the cops pick you up. Having said that, there were some Aboriginals that didn't even know about the permit system because they were never put into a reservation to begin with, and they never even knew that the law existed, and plenty of them went around and they were never really asked anything by cops. In effect, these rules existed, they were rarely checked or enforced by police anyway. If you have people going around for 20 or 30 years not even knowing about these laws because they were never really allocated to a reservation in the first place. And some of them may have been, but just didn't ignore it, you know, didn't take any notice of it or didn't know it, basically. Interestingly enough, why are they forced to stay on the reservation? White man can just no. No, actually no. White man can't just come into the reservation. White man would have to contact the same set office to enter Aboriginal lands or have some sort of a government employee reason for being in there. And of course, in that, he would also still, even if he was a government contractor, there would be paperwork involved in dealing with them, whether they're doctors or whatever. And this is the thing. You can't just go into Aboriginal lands even today. In many areas of Northern Australia, you have to go through Aboriginal lands because it's the only road available to get from one side to the other. And while in there, and while entering there, you have to empty all your alcohol out on the ground, only have a certain amount of alcohol, allow your vehicle to be searched by Aboriginals who are, you know, part of the administration for that reservation. All this stuff exists today. And, yeah, you don't want to carry too much alcohol too far up north because you'll be emptying a lot out on the bloody ground. Anyway, they would originally have to go and get permits. Now, you may say, well, that's, you know, that's racist, that's segregation. Why are they forced to stay in? Well, they're not forced to stay in there, but they can get a permit to go out. But I know what you're saying. It's not necessarily terribly easy, you know, to have to, you know, go through all that crap. But see, there's another side to all this narrative that nobody is looking into, that nobody guessed, and that is, if they're on a reservation, you know they are safe. Because any bizarre shenanigans, such as guys trying to be pimps and turning these girls into prostitution, isn't a problem because a white man can't just walk onto the reservation without all the right permits and all that sort of shit. And this is the thing. If they're in a reservation, you know they're safe. Now, if they're out of a reservation, in amongst the wider community, I'll be perfectly honest, and it is no bloody secret, a lot of these women are fairly naive. And in that, being naive and being out in the wider world, they may easily fall victim to more or less being kidnapped or being convinced to work somewhere and then agreeing to that and essentially being taken out somewhere where they're not really kidnapped, but in effect they are, because they're unable to leave because it is such a far distance to get home, and with no ability to get home if they've been taken quite a significant distance away. You know, and these things of, well, we'll give you a job, but realistically you go on, you know, 200 miles away and I'm going to rape you every night. You know, that sort of stuff couldn't happen because, you know, if they weren't back, they'd go looking for them and they'd try and establish where they went and what happened to them. So in effect they were protected by being on a reservation and having permits when they left to know where else they were going, because stupid things like offers of employment that effectively turned into being kidnapped could be turned down. You know, that not could be turned down, it just wouldn't happen to begin with, because, well, the permit says I can't just disappear to your place without filling out more paperwork and all the stuff that goes with it. You know, and this ability to sort of trap a naive Aboriginal woman into a tight situation, like indentured servitude or sort of employment with bad intentions, that couldn't happen. They also couldn't be dragged into prostitution for the same reason, and things like that. So in effect, although the right-wing narrative and the left-wing narrative won't tell you, they were effectively basically protected from racism from the outside world, and not so much racism but manipulation and being taken advantage of, particularly when it comes to Aboriginal women. And that's sort of something that doesn't sort of crop up when there's all this political narrative behind it, you know. And the other aspect of it was, and this was a big part of it too, you know, this was another factor where, you know, they'd really look into these things, was disease outbreak. So that if there was a outbreak of some sort of disease in one of these Aboriginal communities, they'd say, bang, that's it, they'd seal it. And they'd just go, well, we've got to eradicate the disease here and treat everyone so that it doesn't spread outside of the reservation and so other Aboriginals don't catch it. Because you've got to realise that their immune system was not used to diseases, because a lot of the diseases we brought here. You know, and that's sort of another aspect of it, is that they effectively, as much as they might have been controlled in that way, they were saved from the rest of the outside world. And while it mightn't make sense to you as a white person, when you've met and dealt with these people, particularly ones who have lived their entire life isolated from Western culture, you'll see what I'm talking about. And there's always got to be the narrative of, oh, well, they're just as adept. Well, actually, they're not adept, you know, in white society that much. You know, there's plenty of them who they had to learn the concept of money because it was so damn foreign to them and stuff like that. It's just, you know, there were ones in the 70s that were found who had not seen white man, and they were 30 years old and they'd never seen white man ever, even though they're 30 years old. And this was, you know, the case in the 70s and stuff like that. There's ones alive today who still talk about the first time they saw a white man. You know, and it's sort of, because of these cultural differences, they'd stick to themselves, and also because of those, they hadn't had experience in white culture. They didn't know, they didn't understand the concept of money, for starters, let alone any of the other manipulations like indentured servitude, like, the fact that kidnapping was even a bloody crime to begin with, prostitution, or anything like that. And sort of, it's just really a mechanism, in a way, to keep an eye on them, not so much to control them and march them around like Jews in a concentration camp, but to know that there's nothing bad becoming of them. And there was things where they tried to, like the Stolen Generation, tried to, bring them into white culture, and it worked for some, it backfired for most. But they'd actually deliberately try and pick kids that they would believe were half-caste. The stupid thing is they'd go and grab some kids one time and they'd say, oh, well, we've seen some others that were white, but we didn't have enough time or resources to take, so they'd go back and have a second go. And these poor Aboriginal mothers would be living in fear that they were coming back to have their kids grabbed again, And, there was some very bad situations like that, and I've sort of touched on that a bit previously. There's even someone my parents knew and I knew him, and, he'd grown up, he'd actually done reasonably well with that, and he was actually a pastor, taken in by Anglicans. Most of them were taken in by Catholics, but he could never change gears. They gave him a manual car and he said, I just cannot get my head around changing gears. And he just couldn't, and he'd been driving for years, and every gear change, he just about dropped cogs out of the bottom of that poor bloody car, They ended up buying him an automatic. The trouble is, the automatic they bought him was a particular model that also had transmission failures with the computer in it, would change the gears, just randomly throw back to a lower gear and rev the life out of the engine. So when they finally got him an automatic, they got one that had a really renowned problems with the gearbox, which was not that great. But anyway, that's, a bit of a talk on it, but you don't realise that this whole idea of sort of like, oh, they're not in society, they're not in, white society. Well, some of them used to say, well, whose society are you talking about? I'm fine, I'm in my society. Why is this assumption that I necessarily want to be in white society? No, necessarily, they didn't necessarily, And a lot of it was self-imposed segregation because they didn't understand it and/or didn't like it. So they just go, well, fuck it. I'll just stay in the bush and I'll stick with my own people doing my own thing. I don't need to have anything to do with white people. And if I don't like their way or their system, or I don't understand their system, or I don't agree with their system, I don't have to deal with them. I just stay in the bush and forget about it. And, that's sort of what happened. This whole, well, it's apartheid version 2. No, it actually wasn't. It wasn't at all. But anyway, that's my waffle and all that today.